Bloomberg is now in your dashboard with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto.
Yeah, it's free with the latest version of the Bloomberg Business app.
Gives you access to every Bloomberg podcast, live audio feeds from Bloomberg Radio, plus hear the latest headlines at the click of a button with Bloomberg News Now.
Yeah, it's the Bloomberg Business app. Get it on your phone in the Apple App Store or on Google Play.
Just download the app, connect your phone to your car, and get started. It's presented by our sponsor, Interactive Brokers.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Let's get the latest developments on the war in the Middle East. The U.S. has conducted airstrikes in eastern Syria on targets linked to Iran. Those strikes come as talks intensify to secure the release of hostages in the Gaza Strip. As Bloomberg News Managing Editor Sylvia Westall reports, President Biden discussed that issue with the leader of Qatar last night.
Qatar's got quite an important role in this. It's already helped mediate between Israel, Hamas, and foreign governments to release a small number of people. And the estimates are for around about 200 hostages still trapped there. And those talks are ongoing. There's been discussions between Biden and the ruler of Qatar and all these countries involved. And Israel said it won't even contemplate a ceasefire until those hostages are released.
Bloomberg Sylvia Westall reports President Biden also talked about increasing the flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza with Qatar's premier.
Well, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Etna was asked about whether there could be a deal to exchange captives with Hamas.
There could be, but I think the less I say about it, the more I'll increase the chances that it materializes. And it's a result of pressure, military pressure, the extraordinary work that the IDF is doing.
And Prime Minister Netanyahu was on NBC's Meet the Press, but Israeli President Isaac Herzog is expressing caution.
There are talks, of course, behind the scenes. I cannot confirm any details. What I can say is that there is nothing substantial right now on the table. The United States is also heavily involved in this, so there's nothing tangible that I can report.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog was a guest on CBS's Face the Nation, and you can hear Face the Nation and Meet the Press every Sunday on Bloomberg Radio.
Turning to politics back here at home, Karen, there is now one less Republican candidate for president. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott has ended his campaign. Scott says he will not immediately make an endorsement in the race, and he's not looking to join a Republican ticket as a vice presidential candidate.
Well, Nathan, the U.S. faces a risk of a government shutdown at the end of this week. Meanwhile, House Speaker Mike Johnson is trying a new approach to funding the government, but Bloomberg's Ed Baxter reports the shutdown risks still linger.
The Johnson plan would extend some government funding until January 19th and others until February 2nd. It also declined to do the immediate 30% spending cuts demanded by the right wing of his party. So that means fewer Republican votes and reliance on Democrats to cross lines and vote for it. He says spending addiction cannot be broken overnight. Democrats so far have been moot. White House, though, has already said it would only lead to future shutdowns. Johnson says he's scheduling a vote for tomorrow. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Ed, thank you. Well, former New York Fed President Bill Dudley is warning the U.S. fiscal position is on a, quote, unsustainable trajectory. Dudley is also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. He told a conference in Sydney there's a lack of political will to resolve the crisis at a time when debt costs are soaring.
Nathan, the warning from Dudley comes just 2 days after the U.S. was threatened with the loss of its last top credit rating. Moody's Investors Service signaled it was inclined to downgrade the nation because of wider budget deficits and political polarization. Deborah Cunningham is Global Liquidity Markets Chief Investment Officer at Federated Hermes.
The concerns being more what's happening from a congressional perspective and the dysfunctionality from a lawmaking standpoint is the concern rather than the actual quantitative financials. So I think from an impact as much on the economy, from an impact on where rates are at this point, I think that's behind us.
And Deborah Cunningham at Federated Hermes says Moody's is the only one of the three main credit companies with a top rating on the U.S.
Karen, we're watching for major geopolitical news this week. President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping are scheduled to meet face-to-face on Wednesday as the United States hosts the annual Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference for the first time since 2011. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says resuming military communications is crucial.
When it comes to managing the relationship, ties and communications between our two militaries are critical. The Chinese have basically severed those communication links. President Biden would like to reestablish them, and he will look to this summit as an opportunity to try to advance the ball on that.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan tells CNN the Biden-Xi meeting's also expected to cover the Israel-Hamas war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, human rights, and artificial intelligence.
Well, Nathan, ahead of the Biden-Xi meeting, we are seeing signs of improving U.S.-China relations. Sources say Beijing is weighing ending a freeze on Boeing's 737 MAX aircraft in China. Boeing has not made any significant sales of its best-selling narrow-body jets in China since at least 2018. In another development earlier this morning, the Emirates announced it was buying Boeing aircraft valued at $52 billion.
As for the broader market, Karen, investors have another major event to look forward to tomorrow when we get the latest reading on inflation with the Consumer Price Index for October. Anna Wong is chief U.S. economist with Bloomberg Economics.
We are expecting the headline CPI to be very soft because seasonally adjusted gasoline prices actually came down over 5% in October. So a monthly increase of 0.1% on the headline CPI.
Bloomberg chief U.S. economist Anna Wong says overall consumer price data are expected to show inflation easing to a year-on-year rate of 3.3% in October.
Time now for a look at some of the other stories making news around the world. For that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Scott Carr. Scott, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Donald Trump Jr. will be back on the stand today in New York as the first defense witness in the Trump Organization civil fraud trial. The Trump family organization's being accused of fraudulently inflating their wealth on paper to obtain better loans. The New York Attorney General's office ended its arguments last Wednesday and was denied a motion to limit certain expert witnesses from testifying for the defense. One person is dead, 4 others injured after a shooting at a flea market in Texas. Police in Pearland, Texas, say 3 adults and 2 children were shot at the popular street market yesterday afternoon. Officer Chad Rogers says the incident started as an argument between 2 people, though it's unclear if they both had guns.
3 adult victims and 2 children. There's a lot of people that are very, very upset. This does not appear to be a targeted attack on the flea market, that this was a disturbance between 2 individuals that resulted in people being shot.
So far, no arrests have been made. All 5 victims were taken to local hospitals. A state of emergency has been declared in Los Angeles by California Governor Gavin Newsom after fire broke out underneath a storage yard early Saturday morning, igniting highly flammable wooden pallets, trailers, and cars, then jumped to another storage yard, growing in size to 8 acres at one point, causing the closure of LA's Highway 10 in both directions. The freeway remains closed, and officials say they'll be lucky if they can get one lane open today.
The traffic is going to be horrendous. It's going to really impact Los Angeles.
The blaze burned through the equivalent of 6 football fields. The governor says the state is mobilizing resources to complete repairs and minimize the impact for travel in and around the city. Iceland is evacuating a resort town south of the capital of Reykjavik out of fear the town of Grindavik may be destroyed by a volcanic eruption. The town is near an active volcanic system and was evacuated over the weekend after magma shifting beneath the ground triggered hundreds of earthquakes. Local officials say the magma was at a very shallow depth, so they were expecting an eruption at any time. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Scott Carr, and this is Bloomberg.
All right, Scott, thank you. Well, we bring you news throughout the day right here on Bloomberg Radio. But now, as Scott said, you can get the latest news on demand whenever you want it. Subscribe to Bloomberg News Now to get the latest headlines at the click of a button. Get informed on your schedule. You can listen and subscribe to Bloomberg News Now on the Bloomberg Business app, Bloomberg.com, plus Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update. Here's John Stashower. John.
Karen, Sunday number 10 in the NFL began for the second week in a row in Frankfurt, Germany. The Colts beat the Patriots 10-6. That drops New England to 2-8, their second 3-game losing streak of the season. They have the worst record in the AFC. Only Carolina has a worse record in the NFL. The Patriots have scored over 17 points only twice in 10 games. Another win for red-hot Houston Texans. It was 30-27 at Cincinnati. Texans won it on a field goal on the final play. They've won 5 games, which is more than they had won in any of the last 3 seasons. Bengals' 4-game win streak comes to an end. They fall to last place in the AFC North, where Cleveland won at Baltimore 33-31. The Browns were down by 14 with 9 minutes left, scored 2 touchdowns in a 43-second span. Then they won on a game-winning field goal. That ends the Ravens' 4-game winning streak, and the Browns are only a half game behind. The 49ers ended their 3-game losing streak. They won big at Jacksonville, 34-3. Brock Purdy threw 3 touchdown passes. The Commanders lost in Seattle, 29-26. The Seahawks won on a field goal final play. Last night, the Raiders beat the Jets 16-12. Third straight loss for the Warriors, beaten at home by Minnesota 116-110. Philadelphia won it over Indiana as Tyrese Maxey scored 50 points, dedicated the win to Kelly Oubre of the Sixers, who's going to be out significant time after injury suffered in a car accident Saturday night. Texas A&M and a surprise fired football coach Jimbo Fisher. They'll owe him $75 million in a buyout. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports.
From coast to coast, from New York to San Francisco, Boston to Washington, D.C., nationwide on SiriusXM, the Bloomberg Business app, and Bloomberg.com. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager. Now to the latest from the Middle East. The U.S. continues to strike targets in eastern Syria that are linked to Iran as Israel intensifies its ground campaign against Hamas in northern Gaza. All this as talks continue on the international level to try to release Hamas hostages. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg Israel economy and government reporter Galit Altstein in Tel Aviv. Galit, good morning. What's the latest we can say now about the ground assault? Of course, there's been a lot of focus in recent days on the Al-Shifa hospital that Israel says is hiding a main military headquarters for Hamas.
Right. Good morning, Nathan. So, as you mentioned, we're seeing the Israeli army pushing forward on the ground operation in Gaza, in northern Gaza. The Israeli troops have been conducting raids over the past hours at the outskirts of the Al-Shati. That's a camp in northern Gaza. They've been targeting what they say is terrorist infrastructure that they say is located in central governmental institutions in the heart of civilian population, and that involves schools, universities, mosques, and residences. At the same time, you mentioned Al-Shifa Hospital. So we've been hearing that the last generator at Al-Shifa ran out of fuel 2 days ago, November 11th. And yesterday, Israel said that it allowed delivery of fuel, 300 liters of fuel for the first time to this hospital. And then Israel has claimed that Hamas has prevented the hospital from collecting this fuel. So we have to wait and see on what happens with that. The hospital director has said to media that this quantity, even if it had been collected, is far enough from being enough. He said it would only be sufficient for as little as 30 minutes of operations in the hospital. So we're still waiting to see what happens on that, and also on the evacuation of babies from this hospital, which the IDF promised to facilitate and has not yet happened, according to Israel, because Hamas has also been preventing that.
And as the ground offensive goes on, Galit, of course, we're hearing more talk about trying to secure the release of hostages in the Gaza Strip. President Biden held talks last night with Qatar's emir about that. What role could Qatar play in this situation?
Right. So Kata is considered to be a very important player, perhaps the most significant player in these negotiations on the release of hostages. There are 239 hostages that are still being held in Gaza. So as you mentioned, President Joe Biden did speak with the Qatari emir, and he said that the urgent ongoing efforts to secure additional releases are going on. What we're hearing from Israeli media at the same time is a lot of caution on these talks. We've heard Israeli President Isaac Herzog express caution about a possible release of hostages held by Hamas. He said last night that there's nothing substantial right now on the table, although we are using all tools possible, quote unquote. That's what he said. And Israeli media have been reporting that talks are on the release of around 80 hostages. Probably women, children, and elderly will be prioritized if this release does take place, with Hamas demanding a ceasefire of roughly 3 to 5 days in return for these releases, and a similar number of Palestinian prisoners to be released as well. As I said, everyone is discussing this with a lot of caution, and it's not clear whether these talks will show any results anytime soon.
In the meantime, Israel is also continuing to face fire from Hezbollah in the north, coming from Lebanon. Is the Israeli military, in our last minute here, Galit, at risk of getting under further strain, potentially getting stretched?
Right. So this is a very important point. Yesterday, there was a very clear sense of escalation on Israel's border with Lebanon. It was the most intense day of fighting since October 7th. A lot of back and forth fire. Some civilians, 10 civilians were injured. Israeli civilians were injured in these fire exchanges. So Israel has been retaliating, all the time to these attacks. There have also been some attacks this morning, although at a slightly lower scale with no one injured. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange is down for a second straight day following these events. So this is being closely watched on all fronts. And, I will mention finally that Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was asked at a press conference on Saturday night what would be Israel's red line on this border. And he answered the reporter who asked this, when we strike in Beirut, you'll know that this red line had been crossed.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.